like, before I begin to talk, to acknowledge the presence of so many of my relatives and friends. And I want to express a deep debt of gratitude for you for coming to hear me speak today. It is a great pleasure and an honor to be with you today as you celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Little Falls Meeting House. I was asked by my good friend Hunter Sutherland to speak on the research I have been doing in tracing my ancestral roots in Harford County. But as my husband will tell you, he's here somewhere, that's a dangerous thing to do. Don't get me started on talking about genealogy because you won't be able to shut me up. And there's some truth to that because genealogical research is really one of the most interesting and fascinating things I have ever done. I have been driven to do my research by two main factors. One is a biblical reason. In the Bible, one can come face to face with extensive genealogy. Who begat whom can be traced in the Bible for many, many generations. Also, one is made aware in the Bible of the importance of passing on family history and traditions. Doing this is very important to me. The other factor is my firm belief that by exploring the past, we can appreciate more fully the present and have greater hope for the future. Searching our family roots has been a long and tedious job, which is still not complete. Much information was obtained by searching census records, wills, deeds, land records, marriage records, death records, birth records, military records, maps, books, and a variety of other resource materials. The Historical Society of Harford County provided a wealth of information, such as private papers, including letters, diaries, business, and personal account books. There are a number of members of the Historical Society who are very knowledgeable about the county and who are willing and were willing to share with me their knowledge, such as Mary Wright Barnes. Is Mary here? Hunter Sutherland. Hunter did some research work on manumission of slaves and also the purchase of slaves. And he shared this information with me, which proved very, very helpful. I know Marlene Magnus is here. Where's Marlene? Okay, I saw Marlene outside. And Marlene and Mary Wright Barnes, every time they would run across something related to Barnes, would mail the information to me. Black cemeteries in Harford County also provided valuable information on births and deaths. This information helped me locate other important documents. For example, one can get information from a tombstone on the exact date of the birth. This information can help you get a death certificate, and many counties have on the death certificates the name of the mother of the deceased. I located the death certificate of my great-great-grandmother. Her mother's name was listed, so this put me back another generation from a great-great-great-grandmother. So that is very valuable information. A unique characteristic about researching black family roots is that it is necessary to trace the roots of the slave owner's family and to learn about them because slaves were often willed, given, sold, or hired out to other family members. I have done an extensive genealogy on the White Bond family, the Thomas Bond family, in order to trace the movement of the bond slaves from one bond to another. In order to put your family history in the proper context, it is also necessary to study the history of specific periods. What were the laws governing slavery? What about the Civil War? What impact did that have on your family? Researching black history can be rather difficult. One reason is that many of our ancestors were slaves, and on most slave records, only first names were used. Also, one must draw heavily on oral history because our ancestors, for the most part, were not allowed to learn to read or write. Interestingly enough, though, oral history is often validated by subsequent written documents. Using the aforementioned resources and many more, and using some of the techniques developed, I was able to develop the following history of the Bond family, a black family with roots in Harford County, Maryland. Slightly more than half of all the slaves that came to America did so in the 40-year period between 1740 and 1780. Approximately 210,000 slaves came in those 4 decades. Maryland's black population during that span more than doubled. It was during this period that reportedly an African lady from the Guinea coast of West Africa first landed on American soil, snatched from her birthplace in Africa and forced into slavery thousands of miles away in Harford County, Maryland. While the slave population in Maryland was continuing to increase, the Indian population was rapidly decreasing. Indians had once freely roamed the state, hunting and fishing. They were gradually, however, forced from their land by white settlers until by the end of the 18th century, few Indians could be found in Maryland. An example of this type of land acquisition can be found in the way that Thomas Bond of Emerton expanded his lands in Harford County. The Susquehannock Indians, before the settlement of the area by whites, had used Harris's Trust as hunting grounds. Harris's Trust was registered by Thomas Bond. Bond made plantations by cutting down trees and planting tobacco. He continued to live there, building upon the land a large mansion and constantly acquiring adjacent lands. He called his land Bond's Forest. Bond kept expanding his lands, thus gradually decreasing the hunting grounds for Indians. Thomas Bond of Emerton lived and died a strict Quaker. In his old age, he made over to his sons John and Thomas an acre of land at Fallston for this very Quaker meeting house and burying grounds that you are seeing now. Legend has it that an Indian named Will, the last representative of one of the Maryland tribes, lived on Bond's Forest in Fallston. According to stories passed down through our family, the slave girl from West Africa snatched from her land, and Indian Will, with his land snatched from him, met and became the ancestors of this family. Indian Will reportedly assumed the name Bond from the Thomas Bond family. Thus, the name Bond was handed down through our family. The identification of Indian Will as our ancestor was based mainly on conversation with senior members of our family. The late Ellis Scott of Bel Air, Maryland, 93 at the time of the interview, stated that Joshua Bond's grandfather's name was Will. Joshua Bond was my great-great-grandfather, as you can see from the papers that were passed out to you. She said that people in the older days didn't talk much or tell you much about the past, but she heard the name was Will. Edna Wheeler, also a descendant of Indian Will, said the name Bond in our family came from that Indian. This information then led to a search for an Indian named Will. Further research turned up 2 mentions of an Indian Will. One appeared in the Harford County Chancery Record. It stated, Thomas Bond, age 47, on the holy evangelist of Almighty God, deposeth and saith, between 20 and 30 years of age, he was hunting with Abraham McCleary when he came to this small branch. McCleary then asked him if he knew what it was called. The answer he told him he knew not. McCleary then said it was called Indian Will's Cabin Branch, And from that time, as long as the deponent stayeth in the parts, you always heard it called Indian Will's Cabin Branch. That was dated 1799. Mary Wright Barnes sent me additional information recently relating to this Indian will. Another mention of Indian will appears in the book Bonds of the Earth. This book is about the family of Bonds, who were the plantation owners who owned our ancestors. A section of the book talks about the old Bond homestead located in Fallston. It states, "As a boy, I used to visit with considerable awe the site of King Ben's cottage, and also the mound of stones near the sedge field, which they told me were the ruins of Indian Will's cabin, where the last representatives of one of our Indian tribes lived." I was reading that book in the Library of Congress, and when I found the name Indian Will, I let out the Library of Congress. I said, "Oh, Indian Will." This indicates that there was an Indian Will who lived on the Bond plantation. Whether this Indian Will is connected with the one that McCleary talked about is not known at this time. Further research will have to be done to connect those two Indian wills. The name of a will appears on the 1776 census for Bush River Lower in Harford County. Will is listed as a slave on the plantation of Jacob Bond, Sr., son of Thomas. Will's age is given as 15, which places his birth around 1761. Will remained with Jacob Bond until Jacob Bond Sr. died. Will was then passed on to Jacob Bond Jr. Jacob Bond Jr. died in 1804. The name of Will appears on the 1804 inventory of the property of Jacob Bond Jr. No further written record of Will has been found at the time of this writing. It should be pointed out that the only times the name of a will appears on bond records are the times mentioned above, which may indicate that this is the will that is our ancestor. The identification of the African lady as our ancestor was also based on oral history. Very little is known about the African lady other than a few stories handed down through our family. One story told by Edna Wheeler, a descendant of the African lady, is that the African lady was visiting her daughter-in-law, Sarah Bond, the wife of Corbin Bond, who was the son of the African lady. Sarah had just recently given birth to a child. Sarah's daughter, Harriet, asked her mother, "Who is that old black lady?" Sarah said, "Hush, child, that is your grandmother. She is from Africa." The African lady reportedly whacked Harriet for calling her black in such a derogatory manner. Another story about the African lady is that she handed down in our family the custom of slipping up behind someone on the birthday and greasing his nose. My mother, Ethel Bond Hackley, told me that she sneaked up behind her father, Harry Bond, and greased his nose. Apparently, he didn't like the custom because he turned around and bopped her. I began to wonder if this perhaps had been a custom brought to America by the African lady. I decided to try to find out. By chance, a friend was going to Senegal, West Africa. I asked him to inquire about this custom while he was there. This he did, and located people who had heard about the custom but could not pinpoint its origin. He introduced me to a Senegalese lady who later became my house guest. She in turn invited me to Senegal, so off I went to Senegal to see what I could find out about the African lady and to learn something about the culture in that part of the world. I arrived in Dakar, Senegal about 10 o'clock in the morning, Friday, April the 18th, 1986. I was met at the airport by Fatou Kader, my Senegalese friend whose house guest I was to be. As is the custom, many of Fatou's relatives came to greet me and to welcome me to Senegal. Many had traveled from distant villages. The women wore pretty and colorful robes called boubous, and the men wore long robes. All we could do was smile at one another. We could not speak to one another, because they spoke only a native tongue called Walla. I thought to myself that the African lady must have experienced something similar on the slave ship, having been thrown on board with people from other tribes who did not speak her language. Pt2's maids had prepared a traditional dish called shebujan. In it was rice, cauliflower, fish, turnips, carrots, and potatoes. We all washed our hands in a bowl of soap and water, the same bowl. The shebujan was then placed in a large dishpan which was set on the floor, and everyone sat on the floor and ate the food from the pan with their hands. I couldn't do it because the people would put their hand in the food, eat it, then put it back. They said, "You aren't eating." So I got a little corner, just pretended that I was eating, because as an Afro-American, I was too far removed from those customs, and I just could not deal with that. After the meal was completed, we sat on the ground in the backyard court. Pt2's maids were washing clothes. They did all the washing by hand. They used a brush to scrub the clothes clean. There were 4 pans of water. The first one contained soap. The last one contained bluing. The clothes were hung up to dry. They were later ironed with an iron that contained hot coals. This was done to save electricity, which is very, very costly in Senegal. With jet lag coming down fast on me, I retired early to prepare for a trip the following day to Gorée Island. Gorée Island is about 22 minutes from Dakar by ferry. We boarded the ferry at the harbor. The ferry was very crowded. There were diverse people aboard: tourists, natives trying to sell their wares, pickpockets trying to work the crowd, a retired U.S. ambassador now residing on Gorée Island, and others headed for a pleasant day on the beach. The ferry swung around the tip of the island, past the circular fort, and docked at a long, narrow pier. We were met at the pier by a Mr. Balde, a servant of the governor. Mr. Balde took us on a tour of the island. He took us to his quarters, where we saw his wife prepare shebujan over hot coals. After the meal was ready, the family sat on the ground around a big pan and ate the food with their hands, just as had been done the day before at Pt2's. Balde's family is Fulani. They speak only Walla, though Balde also spoke French. After visiting Balde's home, we continued on our tour. We went to La Maison des Esclaves, house of slaves, where many slaves from the Senegambia were brought to be carried to and sold in America. The average stay for a slave here was about 3 months. While there, they were forced to do hard labor. At one time, La Maison held 400 slaves at a time. It contained several slave pens. The slave pens had no windows. Each pen was no bigger than 20 by 30 feet. Slaves were chained and stuffed by the dozen into these pens. There were separate pens for children who were separated from their mothers. There were also separate pens for men and women. There, of course, were no toilet facilities, so that slaves had to tend to their toilets within those crowded pens. The pens had very narrow slits in the wall to permit a small passage of air. There was a special pen for recalcitrant slaves. Slaves were chained to the wall, and seawater was piped into the room. This kept the slaves partially submerged and constantly wet. There were also pens where slaves were bred and fattened. Slaves were inspected without any regard to privacy. Breasts and genitals were inspected as if the slaves were animals. Slaves were weighed like cattle. There's a doorway in La Maison des Esclaves called the doorway of no return. In years gone by, The doorway opened onto a 200-foot pier where slave ships were docked and where sharks lurked. Those slaves who were not strong enough to endure the 3 months at Goree Island were fed to the sharks. It was through this doorway of no return that many slaves passed, never to set foot on their homeland again. Like those who passed through this doorway of no return, the African lady left Africa never to return again. My trip to Africa was for her. She never returned, but I did. I slowly walked through that doorway of no return, then turned around and came back through it. If I was free to do this, she was not. The highlight of my trip to Goree was my meeting with Joseph Njai, curator of the Slavery House and local historian. Mr. Njai speaks beautiful French, complete with intonations, and dramatizes the hardships endured by slaves. My meeting with Mr. Njai was in a private session, which afforded me the opportunity to discuss my research with him. I told him of my family custom of slipping up behind someone on his birthday and greasing his nose. Mr. Njai said that was a custom of the Serrers from the Sini Saloum area of Senegal. He said the custom probably came from the Fulani, who used to live in that same area. I thanked Mr. Njai for the valuable information, but as I left Goree Island, I knew within my heart that before I left Senegal, I was going to venture to the Sini Saloum area. Sunday, April the 27th, 1986, I kept that promise I made to myself as I left Goree Island, that I would go to the Sini Saloum area to see if I could find anyone who knew anything about my family custom of coming up behind someone on his birthday and greasing his nose. The trip to the Sini Saloum area took about 2.5 hours from Dakar. We passed many villages. Villages were different. Some had thatched roofs, some had houses made of adobe, brick. Cattle were seen everywhere, as were sheep, goats, and mules. We often had to stop to avoid hitting cattle or mules as they crossed from one side of the road to the other. We soon arrived in Jowl, which is in the Sini area. Jowl is an old colonial spot discovered by the Portuguese during the 15th century. The Saloum River divides the Sini area from the Saloum area. We first stopped at a small village of Fimela in the Sini area. We found a man who spoke Wolof and Serer. He said that the people in the village were Serers and spoke only Serer. Fatu, my hostess, spoke Wolof. Therefore, she was able to translate it into English for me, what was told to her in Wolof by our guide who was translating from Serer to Wolof. So it was a three-rate translation, Serer to Wolof to English. The people we talked to in this village had not heard of the custom I was researching. They did say, however, that many slaves had been taken from their village. Slaves from their village were taken to Goree Island. The next stop was in the village of Diofior, still in the Sini area. Diofior is a large village. It has wide dirt roads lined with huts. Many of those huts were made of adobe brick. A boy riding on a horse or a wagon drawn by a mule could be seen going down the road. We were again fortunate enough to find someone who volunteered to take us through the village. He took us first, as was the custom, to see the village griot, or the historian, who was very old. He had never heard of the custom I was researching. Our guide then took us to a spot where 3 old men were seated on the ground. And I felt like Alex Haley, because you would sit down on the ground and listen to the people talk over and over again. The guide told them in Serer that my great-great-great-great-grandmother had been taken from Africa as a slave, and that I was trying to find out something about her origin. He asked them if they knew of a custom of slipping up behind someone on the birthday. No, he didn't say birthday, I'm sorry. Slipping up behind someone and greasing his nose. They talked among themselves for a long, 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 long time. And I grew impatient to know what they were saying. And Pt2 kept telling me, let them talk, let them talk. They said there was a custom at one time in which the chief gathered all the children together to decide which one would be selected to go through a particular ceremony. He then stepped up behind the selected one, greased his nose. The young boys and girls also had a custom of greasing one another's noses or throwing milk on one another. We were then taken to see another old man. The only custom he knew about grease was that girls and boys between the ages of 15 and 20 would wear grease on their faces between April and July. Everywhere we went in the village of Diafior, people gathered around us. My camera fascinated them. Many wanted their pictures taken. After taking pictures, we gave money to each person we interviewed. After bidding our guide farewell, we headed for the other side of the Saloum River, the Saloum area, where we were told that the customs were different from that in the Sini area. We stopped at the village of Ganjai. We located another Sirur who spoke Walla. He took us to see the village notable. His name was Banyak Njai. The hut was extremely dirty, with a cracked cement floor. It had only one small room with a torn curtain. There were animal drippings on the floor. We sat down as Pt2 told the notable of my quest for information concerning the putting of grease on one's nose. The notable was a Sirur, but unlike those in the Sini area, he could speak Walla, which he did. He, too, rambled on and on and on. And my patience was wearing very thin again because the room was extremely hot. Sweat was running off my face. My arms and my hands, which I have never known to sweat before, were soaked with water. Pt2 had to remind me again, let him talk. The notable said that the chief sold slaves in order to get gunpowder. He said there were many fights among the chiefs. There were also religious wars because the people were migrating into the area who had become converted to Islam, whereas many of the people in the village were animists. That is, they believed that all natural objects have souls that live apart from the material bodies. He mentioned also that Fulani came into the area and mixed with the Sirurs and brought some of their customs with them. Just as I could bear the heat no longer and felt that I was learning absolutely nothing, the conversation changed courses, and he began talking about a Sirur custom. He said they would step up behind you on your birthday, grease your nose, and tell you how old you were. I suddenly got excited and asked Pt2 ask him who the they is. He replied, the grandmother. She usually helped with the births, so she would be the one to know how old you are. We had never mentioned the greasing of the nose on the birthday so as not to influence the notable. He himself identified the birthday as the special occasion. I was simply ecstatic. I had found a group that did indeed practice the custom handed down in our family. They were the Sirurs in the Saloum area of the Sini Saloum. Since the notable also pointed out that Fulani had mixed with the Sirurs, there is also the possibility that the custom came from the Fulani, as suggested by Mr. Njai from Goree Island. Thanking the notable for the valuable information, I left the village of Ganjai with mixed emotions. Although I never knew the African lady, I felt a certain closeness to her while I was in the village. I do not know for certain that she ever lived there, but the custom that she passed on to us certainly did. I wondered what her life would have been had she remained there or in a similar village, since the notable himself lived in such squalor. I reflected on the life she must have lived as a slave, and on the hardships she must have endured as she crossed the Atlantic on that crowded slave ship. My thoughts then turned to the easy life that I lived: clean house, plenty of food, many luxuries beyond the bare necessities of life. Silently I said, "Thank you, African lady. It is only because of your suffering that I am where I am today. How many children Indian Will and the African lady had is not known. It is known, however, that they did have a son named Corbin. Although only oral records exist that link Indian Will and the African lady to our family, written records do exist that show our descendancy from Corbin Bond. Anyone growing up in our family heard the story that our maternal great-great-great-grandfather was a very short man, about 4 feet, 5 inches tall, and a very black man whose mother came from Africa. This man was always referred to as the little black guinea man. We never heard his name called. We knew only that he was the grandfather of our great-grandmother, Sarah Jane Hill, who lived with our family. I set out in search of that little black guinea man, and after 5 years of searching, I found him and learned that his name was Corbin Bond. Corbin was born about 1795 in the state of Maryland. Corbin was born a slave because in those days, a baby born to a black woman took on the status of the mother. If the mother was a free woman, then her offspring were free. But if the mother was a slave, her offspring were slaves. Thus was the fate of Corbin Bond. Corbin was owned by Dennis Bond, son of Jacob Bond Sr. and grandson of Thomas Bond of Emerton. Dennis Bond died in 1809 when Corbin was only 16 years old. At that time, slaves were considered personal property, just as cattle and pieces of furniture. Corbin's value on the inventory of Dennis Bond was given as only $280. After Dennis Bond died, Corbin remained on the plantation with Dennis's wife Mary. At some time in his life, Corbin married a slave named Sarah. It is not known whether they followed the slave custom of jumping the broom or whether they were married by a minister at the slave owner's home, as was sometimes done. Corbin and Sarah had 5 children, as far as I have been able to determine. Joshua, from whom I am descended, Sarah Jane, Charles, Harriet, and Phoebe. All of the children carried the name Bond. Oral history indicated, as I pointed out before, that the name Bond started with Indian Will, who had taken the name of his slave owner, who was a Bond. Descendants of Corbin Bond's children can be identified today, and some of them are in the audience today. The name Bond itself, however, seems to have ended with my grandfather, Harry Bond. Corbin and his family did not have the luxury of living together as a family. They were owned by different slave owners. Corbin was owned by Mary Bond. Sarah, his wife, and at least 2 of her children, Harriet and Sarah Jane, were owned by John McKinney Jr. Further research is being done to find out who the owners of the other children were. John McKinney's plantation, however, was not too far from that of Mary Bond's. Both were located in the vicinity of the house now occupied by Mrs. Cameron and by the area by where the Harper Mall is now located. The proximity of the 2 plantations afforded the family the opportunity to get together frequently. Corbin's mother, the African lady, must not have lived too far either, since she came to visit Corbin and Sarah at the birth of a new baby. Corbin Bond did not remain a slave all of his life. He was freed by Mary Bond in 1841 when he was 48 years old. Mary Bond had originally planned to set Corbin free after her death, according to her 1840 will. In the will, however, she expressed a concern that Corbin not be sent out of the state and away from his family once he was freed. It may have been this concern that prompted Mary Bond to free Corbin prior to her death, at which time the law did not require him to leave the state once he was freed. By 1850, Corbin, his wife Sarah, and their little girl Sarah Jane were all free and living together in the 3rd election district. How or when Sarah was freed or by whom is not known. It is known, however, that Sarah was still a slave in 1836 when Sarah Jane was born. Therefore, Sarah Jane was born a slave. John McKinney Jr. freed Sarah Jane and sold her for a penny to Corbin Bond. Hunter Sutherland happened to run across that document as he was doing his research, and he gave me a copy of the document, which is in my possession, where Corbin Bond actually purchased his daughter for 1 penny from John McKinney.
Gwen, may I interrupt to say that she cried out just like she did in the Library of Congress when she found it.
Yes, I did. It gets exciting. Life must have been difficult for Corbin, but no different from that of other freed slaves who had for the first time to fend for themselves. And of course, there were happy times too. Birthdays were then and continue to be in our family. As my son can attest, we have birthday parties every time somebody has a birthday. A time for fun and celebration. Corbin and Sarah's family life included worship. But somewhere along the line, the Bonds who started here as Quakers, some of them became involved in became Methodists and were very involved in the life of the church. Their daughter Sarah Jane, for example, and our Corbin and Sarah's family's life included worship. They became Methodists just as the White Bond families had become Methodists. Sarah Jane and her husband David Norton are buried in the Methodist Church Cemetery in Abington. The daughter Harriet attended the historic Metropolitan AME Church in Washington and reportedly scraped bricks and washed bricks used in the construction of the church during post-Civil War days. Joshua and Charles Bond, Corbin's sons, are named in the history of Ames Methodist Church in Bel Air as trustees. Additionally, Joshua and other Bond members are buried right here in Tabernacle Methodist Cemetery across the road from Bond's Forest in Benson. One might wonder if this involvement in Methodism might not have been the result of Corbin's slave master's family involvement in the same. Thomas Bond of Emerton is said to have been the first member of his family to openly join the Methodist congregation. His 2 brothers, Joshua and Jacob, were early converts and brought their families into the fold. Dr. Thomas E. Bond became editor of the leading publication of the Methodist Church, The Christian Advocate. John Wesley Bond became a regularly ordained itinerant minister. Descendants of Corbin and Sarah Bond are still actively involved in church activities today, another legacy passed on. Corbin Bond and Sarah also passed on a strong sense of and love for family. There was then and continues to be a strong family support system. For example, my sister is here today. I have another sister and a brother, and not a day passes that all 4 of us do not talk. We talk to each other every day on the phone to keep in contact. It's nothing more than a hello, any problems, how are you doing? But this sense of family togetherness is very strong in our family. Very little else is known about Corbin and Sarah Bond. When they died is not known. It must have been sometime between 1860 and 1870 because they are enumerated on the 1860 census, but not on the 1870 census. I am descended from Corbin Bond through his son Joshua. Joshua's daughter, Sarah Jane Bond Hill, was my great-grandmother. We called her Granny. Granny lived with us and helped my parents raise us. Granny was born into slavery in 1852 in Harford County on a Howard plantation. Granny became crippled as a child from rheumatoid arthritis. She said it was due to going barefooted in the fields in the cold. She said the only way she could keep her feet warm was to stand where a cow had lain. Granny wore a platform shoe. This shoe is still in our family. Granny used to tell us that she was 12 years old when freedom came. Indian Will, the African lady, Corbin Bond, Joshua Bond, Sarah Jane Bond Hill, Harry Bond, and Ethel Bond Hackley, my mother, have all departed this earth. They have all gone, but they still live on in our family through the perpetuation of active church involvement and the strong sense of family that we all enjoy. In closing, I would like to say that it is indeed an honor to have been asked to speak at the 250th anniversary of the Little Falls meeting. I'm not very well versed in all the Quaker beliefs, but we do have a few beliefs in common. That is, the belief in Christ as the light which lighteth every man that cometh into the world, and the belief that whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. These two basic beliefs led many Quakers to address the issue of slavery and to risk their lives and those of their families to help slaves gain their freedom. These members of the Society of Friends were not just messengers of love, but they put that message into action. Many Quakers worked with what was known as the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was an elaborate network of secret contacts between free blacks and white sympathizers, set up to help escaped slaves reach freedom by going through the northern states to Canada. Soon it became commonly known among the slaves that by following the North Star, they could escape into free territory. The railroad had many branches. At intervals along the routes were stations, which were usually private homes, caves, or barns, where fugitives were kept and fed during the day, and from which they were sent on their way by night. Since the fugitive slave laws of 1793, 1831, and 1850 forbade such assistance, the work was done at great risk and self-sacrifice by the Quakers. But in spite of these dangers, the agents, station keepers, or conductors, as they were called, numbered more than 3,000. It is estimated that the Underground Railroad was used by about 75,000 fugitive slaves. One of the most active workers and the reputed president of the system was Levi Coffin, a Quaker of Newport, Indiana, who during the period of 33 years harbored about 100 slaves a year. He also traveled to Canada to plan the final stops of the railroad. Alfred Coffin and his brother Addison Coffin also worked with the Underground Railroad. Alfred served as manager of the road in North Carolina from 1836 to 1852, when he was discovered and forced to flee to Indiana. Addison knew many other Quaker collaborators in the neighborhood of Greensboro, North Carolina. Another Quaker conductor was Thomas Garrett of Wilmington, Delaware, who forwarded some 2,700 slaves to freedom in the 2 decades prior to the Civil War. Isaac Hopper, a Quaker, helped some 3,000 fugitives along their way to Canada. In addition to the conductors, there were many Quakers who contributed money, clothing, shelter, and transportation to fugitive slaves. These were your unnamed heroes and heroines who hid the fugitives in their homes or barns, fed and clothed them, and passed them along secretly to the next station in the Underground Railroad. More than 3/4 of the Underground Railroad travelers passed through Michigan. For almost 30 years, fugitives continued to come through Detroit, about the nation's largest terminus. Black ministers there were unusually daring and determined in helping the slaves to freedom. Their congregations sang spirituals, which had hidden messages to announce when a wagon load of slaves would arrive. Such a hymn might be, "Somebody's knocking at your door," or the minister would announce, "Tomorrow night at our special 8 p.m. meeting, we will read Exodus 10th chapter, 8th verse." In underground language, this meant, since Exodus is the second book of the Bible, that conductor 2 will arrive at 8 p.m. with 10 slaves, 8 men and 2 women. The fugitive slaves rode in defiance of bullets, bloodhounds, abuse, possible arrest, and return to slavery and the whip, while their conductors risked punishment or their lives driving carts, carriages, farm wagons, or ferrying them across rivers and streams. The slaves rode hungry, weary, in rags, leaving behind parents, relatives, and possessions. Some rode with lighter complexioned blacks in disguise as master and mistress with their slaves. Some rode in false bottom boxes, wagons, or coffins. This year, while attending the AARP convention in Detroit, I visited the Second Baptist Church, which served as an underground railroad. I went down into the basement room where the fugitives had been hidden. The average wagon coming to the church for shelter, food, and safety held 13 to 20 passengers, including babies and children. They were admitted through an alley door, led down a flight of stairs, and through a winding corridor to a 12 by 13-foot room where they would spend the rest of the night and the next day, leaving when night had once fallen. When darkness came, the fugitives were led to the docks just a few blocks away, where they took a ferry to the other side of the river and to freedom. My hotel room in Detroit overlooked the Detroit River. I could look across the river and see Windsor, Canada on the other side. The river was not very wide, but I kept thinking that just that distance made the difference between slavery and freedom. As I looked across that river, I also thought of the Quaker Levi Coffin, who was mentioned in the Second Baptist Church bulletin on the Underground Railroad as being prominent in establishing this great network of escape, and of other Quakers who had helped gain freedom for slaves. I don't know if Levi Coffin or any of the other brave Quakers connected with the Underground Railroad ever helped any of my bond slave ancestors escape, but I'm very glad to have had this opportunity to acknowledge at this, the 250th anniversary of the Little Falls meeting, a debt of gratitude for those slaves who were helped by many Quakers to escape. May God bless you, and like the Quakers of Ore, may you continue to be messengers of the gospel of love.